I stood in the funeral home beside my husband's casket, and the silence was so thick I could barely breathe. Rows and rows of empty chairs stretched out before me like accusations. Harold lay there in his navy suit, the one he wore to our daughter's wedding, and I was the only one who cared enough to be there. Well, not quite the only one. Mrs. Webb from next door sat in the back row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Father Benedict stood near the entrance, his weathered face full of sorrow that wasn't just for Harold. The guest book by the door had 3 signatures. 3. I'd prepared food for 100 people. The caterers kept glancing at me with pity, and I wanted to disappear. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I clutched Harold's favourite tie, the burgundy one with tiny gold stripes. I'd forgotten to put it on him. Such a small thing, but it felt enormous in that moment. I'd failed him in so many ways these past 3 days. 3 days ago, everything was normal. Harold and I sat at breakfast like we had for 40 years. He was reading the newspaper, complaining about his indigestion acting up again. I told him to take some antacid and stop eating so much bacon. He smiled at me, that gentle smile that never changed in all our years together, and said he'd cut back tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. I found him in the garage 2 hours later. He'd gone to organize his toolbox, something he did when he needed to think. I called out to him about lunch, but he didn't answer. The silence made my stomach drop. I knew before I opened the door. Somehow, I knew. He was on the concrete floor beside his workbench, his tools scattered around him. His face was grey. I screamed his name and dropped to my knees, my hands on his chest, but he was already gone. The paramedics came quickly because Mrs. Webb heard me screaming and called. They tried everything, but the looks on their faces told me what I already knew in my heart. At the hospital, they used words like massive heart attack and nothing we could do, and so sorry for your loss. I sat in that sterile white room and made 3 phone calls that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Whitney answered on the 4th ring. I could hear voices in the background, professional and rushed. "Mum, I'm in the middle of a deposition. Can I call you back in an hour?" I told her father was gone. She went quiet. Then she cried, hard sobs that broke through her lawyer composure. But then someone knocked on her door, and she said she had to go, that she'd call me right back. She did call back 3 hours later, asking about arrangements. Trevor's wife, Cassandra, answered his phone. I could hear party music behind her, glasses clinking, laughter. She put Trevor on, and when I told him, he actually gasped. He cried too, asked me questions about what happened, told me he loved me. Then he said he'd get on the first flight home. I believed him. Natalie was getting ready for some charity gala when I called. She answered video chat by accident, and I saw her in a beautiful gown, makeup half done. When I told her about Harold, her face crumpled. She cried while still looking at herself in her phone screen, and something about that image burned into my brain. She promised to come home immediately. I planned the funeral, thinking they'd be there to help me. I chose Harold's favourite hymns, the ones he hummed while doing dishes. I wrote an obituary that talked about his 40 years at the hardware store, his love of fishing, his devotion to family. That last part hurt to write, but it was true. Harold was devoted to our family. Every single day of his life, he was devoted to us. I picked flowers he would have liked, simple and not too expensive because Harold hated waste. I selected photos for the memory board, pictures of him with the kids when they were small, smiling at baseball games and birthday parties and graduations. He never missed those things. Never. Even when it meant losing opportunities at work, even when it meant being tired, even when it meant sacrifice. Harold showed up. My phone sat beside me while I made these arrangements, and I checked it constantly. Whitney sent work emails between short text messages. Trevor called once, but kept the conversation brief. Natalie posted on social media about unexpected loss and cherishing family, which strangers liked and commented on, but she didn't call me at all. The night before the funeral, I was addressing the programs when my phone lit up 3 times in succession. 3 text messages. 3 daggers to whatever was left of my heart. I read them each twice, then a third time, unable to believe what I was seeing. My children, all 3 of them, weren't coming to their father's funeral. Whitney's message came first, long and detailed like a legal brief. She explained that her firm's biggest case was going to trial, that she was lead counsel, that 5 associates were counting on her, that postponing would cost the client millions. She'd sent a massive flower arrangement, the biggest one in the room, actually, white lilies that Harold would have thought were too expensive. She promised to visit soon, maybe next month, and said Daddy would understand that her career had to come first, right now. Trevor's text was apologetic, almost pleading. Cassandra's parents were renewing their vows, and she'd been planning this anniversary party for 8 months. The venue was booked, 200 guests were invited, and cancelling would humiliate his wife's entire family. He couldn't do that to Cassandra, not when their marriage was already strained. He'd made a $1,000 donation to the Heart Association in Harold's name. Surely I understood how complicated his situation was. Natalie's message was the shortest, and somehow that made it worse. She'd been invited to an exclusive Fashion Week event in New York, the kind of opportunity that only came once in a lifetime. Important designers would be there, people who could change her whole career. She knew Daddy would want her to chase her dreams, not sit around being sad. She'd light a candle for him and think about him all day. She sent a heart emoji and said she loved me. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, reading those messages over and over until the words blurred. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the same clock Harold wound every Sunday morning for 30 years. I thought about smashing it. Instead, I remembered. I remembered when Trevor graduated college across the country, and Harold had a major interview scheduled that same day. The promotion he'd been working toward for 5 years, the one that would have changed our financial situation completely. He cancelled it without hesitation, spent money we didn't really have on last-minute plane tickets, sat in the hot sun for 3 hours watching Trevor walk across that stage. Trevor had hugged him afterward and said, "Thanks for coming, Dad." Like it was nothing. Like it was expected. Harold never got another chance at that promotion. Someone else took the position, and Harold stayed at the same level until he retired. I remembered Whitney's breakdown during bar exam studying. She called at 2 in the morning, hysterical, saying she couldn't do it, that she was going to fail, that her life was over. Harold took 2 weeks of unpaid leave, drove to her apartment, and studied with her every single day. He made flashcards, quizzed her, brought her meals, told her she was brilliant until she believed it. She passed on her first try and thanked him in her celebration speech. Then she moved 3 hours away for a better job opportunity and started visiting less and less. I remembered every dance recital Natalie ever had. Harold worked the early shift at the hardware store, 4 in the morning until noon, just so he could be there at every single performance. He'd sit in those tiny auditoriums with all the other parents, his work boots still dusty, clapping louder than anyone when our little girl twirled across the stage. He kept every recital program in a box in his study. I'd seen him looking through them sometimes, smiling at the memories. My sister Pauline called around midnight. She'd seen the obituary online and wanted to know what she could do. I almost told her the truth. Almost said that my children had abandoned their father even in death, but shame stopped my words. I told her I was fine, that the kids were handling everything, that I just needed rest. She offered to come anyway, but I said no. I couldn't bear for anyone to see how small our family had become. Father Benedict called early the next morning to confirm the service time. His kind voice almost broke me. He asked if the family needed anything, if the children had arrived safely. I lied and said they were here, that we were managing together. I don't know why I protected them, but I did. I spent that whole day moving through the house like a ghost, opening drawers and closets, finding pieces of Harold everywhere. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his coffee mug in the sink, his jacket on the hook by the door, still smelling like him. In his study, I found his wall of pride, every article about Whitney's legal victories, printed and framed. Every mention of Trevor's marketing campaigns, carefully cut from magazines. Every single blog post Natalie ever wrote, printed and kept in binders. Our children's faces smiled from dozens of photos, and Harold smiled back in every single one. He loved them so much. He would have forgiven them for anything. But I wasn't Harold. I stood in front of my closet at dawn on the funeral day, pulling out my black dress. My hands were steady now. I would give Harold the goodbye he deserved, even if I had to do it alone. I arrived at the funeral home 2 hours before the service. The morning was grey and cold, the kind of weather that matched everything I felt inside. The funeral director, Mr. Chen, met me at the door with concerned eyes. He'd clearly expected a family to grieve with, not one woman walking in alone. The staff was still arranging chairs, rows and rows of them fanning out from where Harold's casket sat. I watched them work and wanted to tell them to stop, that all those chairs would stay empty. But my voice wouldn't come. Mr. Chen walked me through the final details. The flowers were arranged beautifully. The programs were stacked neatly by the entrance. The guest book sat open on its stand, waiting for names that wouldn't come. Everything was perfect for a funeral that didn't matter to anyone but me. I sat in the front row, the one reserved for family, and stared at the empty seats beside me. Whitney should have been on my right, Trevor on my left, Natalie beside her brother. Their spouses should have filled the rest of the row. Grandchildren should have been fidgeting in their formal clothes, not understanding why everyone was sad. Instead, there was just space. Empty, accusing space. Mrs. Webb arrived first, slipping in quietly and sitting in the very back row. She caught my eye and nodded, her face full of sympathy that made my throat tight. She barely knew Harold, just neighbourhood hellos and occasional chats over the fence, yet she was here. She showed up. Father Benedict came next, his robes rustling as he approached the front. He looked at the empty chairs, at me sitting alone, and I saw understanding wash over his face. He didn't ask where my children were. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed my shoulder gently and took his place. The service began at exactly 10 o'clock. Mr. Chen waited an extra 5 minutes, probably hoping someone else would arrive, but nobody did. 3 people in a room set for 100. The sound system seemed too loud in all that emptiness. Father Benedict's eulogy was beautiful. He talked about Harold's quiet kindness, his dedication to family, his gentle strength. He told stories about Harold volunteering at the church, helping with repairs, always the first to offer assistance when anyone needed it. Every word was true, and every word hurt. Harold Patterson was a man who understood what mattered, Father Benedict said, his voice echoing in the nearly empty room. He knew that showing up was everything, that being present in the lives of those you love is the greatest gift you can give. I felt those words like physical blows. Harold had showed up for everyone, for our children, for me, for our community. And now, at his final moment, almost no one had showed up for him. Mrs. Webb cried harder than I did. I could hear her soft sobs from the back row while I sat frozen, unable to feel anything anymore. I'd cried myself empty over the past 3 days. Now there was just numbness and a growing anger I didn't know what to do with. During the service, my mind wandered to memories. Harold's last words had been asking about the kids. "Have they called yet?" he'd asked the night before he died, wondering why Whitney hadn't returned his call from earlier that week, why Trevor hadn't sent photos of his new house, why Natalie hadn't responded to his comment on her latest blog post. I'd made excuses for them like I always did. "They're busy, honey. You know how it is." And Harold had nodded, understanding like he always did, making it okay for them to forget about us. I'd lied to him in his final hours at the hospital, too. When he squeezed my hand and whispered, "Tell the kids I love them," I'd said, "They're on their way. They'll be here soon." I'd let him die believing his children cared enough to come. At the cemetery, the wind picked up, biting through my coat. The gravediggers stood at a respectful distance, while Father Benedict said the final prayers. Mrs. Webb stood beside me, this near stranger providing the support my own children should have given. They lowered Harold into the ground, and I watched the casket descend, taking 40 years of my life with it. Not just my husband, but my illusions about my family, about what we meant to each other, about whether any of the sacrifices mattered. My phone buzzed in my purse. Once, twice, 3 times. I ignored it through the entire burial, through Father Benedict's final blessing, through the moment when I was supposed to drop a rose on the casket but couldn't make my hand let go. Only when I was back in my car, alone in the cemetery parking lot, did I check my phone. Messages from all 3 children, casual and light, asking how everything went, sending love and hugs, promising to call soon. Whitney. "Thinking of you today, Mom. The flowers looked beautiful in the photos. We'll visit next month." Trevor. "Hope the service was nice. Dad's in a better place now. Love you." Natalie. "Lit my candle for Daddy, sending positive vibes your way." I sat there as the sun began to set, reading those messages that treated their father's funeral like a minor event they'd unfortunately missed. Something inside me shifted, hardened. I scrolled through my contacts and found Helen's number. She was a lawyer, an old friend from my book club. I pressed call. "Helen?" I said when she answered. "I need to change my will." Helen met me at a small cafe the next morning. She studied my face across the table, probably seeing things I didn't want to show. Dark circles under my eyes, new lines around my mouth, a hardness that hadn't been there a week ago. "Are you sure you want to do this now?" she asked gently. "Grief can make us feel things we don't mean." "I've never been more sure of anything," I said. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a notepad. "Tell me what you're thinking." I took a breath and laid it all out. Harold had a life insurance policy worth $800,000. Our house, completely paid off after decades of mortgage payments, was worth $650,000. His retirement accounts had another $400,000. Together, we'd built almost $2 million through careful saving and modest living. Helen's eyebrows rose. She knew how simply we'd lived, how Harold had driven the same truck for 15 years, how I'd clipped coupons and shopped sales. We could have traveled, could have enjoyed luxuries, but we'd always thought we were building something for our children. "The current will split everything 3 ways?" Helen asked. "Equal shares, plus education funds for the grandchildren." My coffee sat untouched, getting cold. I want to change all of it. Helen was quiet for a moment. What do you want instead? The house gets sold. All proceeds go to establishing the Harold Patterson Memorial Scholarship Fund for underprivileged children in our community. The words came easily because I'd thought about nothing else all night. Kids whose parents show up to their games and recitals but can't afford college. Kids who understand what family means. Helen wrote quickly, her pen scratching across paper. The life insurance and retirement funds get split between 5 charities. The Children's Hospital, where Harold volunteered for 10 years. The homeless shelter, where he served meals every Thanksgiving. The animal rescue, where we got our dog. The Veterans Support Organization. And the church. And your children? Helen asked quietly. Each of them gets $1,000 and a letter explaining exactly why. Helen set down her pen. Maggie, I have to ask you to really think about this. Once you're gone, this can't be undone. Your children will know how you felt in this moment for the rest of their lives. I thought about Whitney, who borrowed $30,000 for her first house down payment 7 years ago. Just until my next bonus, Dad, she'd said. The money never came back, and Harold never mentioned it again. I thought about how that down payment had helped launch her into a career where she now made more in a month than Harold made in a year. I thought about Trevor's business venture, the one he was so excited about, the one he promised would change everything. Harold invested $50,000 of his retirement savings. The business failed within 18 months. Trevor apologized once, briefly, then never spoke of it again. Harold went back to work part-time after retirement to rebuild what he'd lost. I thought about Natalie's college education, $70,000 over 4 years, while her friends graduated buried in debt. We'd paid every penny so she could start her life free and clear. She'd thanked us at graduation, then moved to the expensive part of town and started a lifestyle blog about luxury living that we could never afford. They've already had their inheritance, I said. Harold gave it to them piece by piece, every time they needed something, every time they asked, every time they didn't even have to ask because he anticipated their needs before they did. Helen nodded slowly. What about the letter? What will you say? The truth, that I loved them enough to give them what Harold couldn't. Consequences. We spent the next hour drafting the new will. Helen kept pausing, giving me chances to reconsider. But I didn't waver. When everything was written, she had one more question. When do you want this to take effect? Do you want them to know now? I thought about that. Part of me wanted to tell them immediately, to watch their faces when they realized what their choices cost them. But that wasn't the point. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It stays secret until I die, I said. This isn't about making them feel bad. It's about Harold's legacy going to people who will value it. I signed the papers with a steady hand. Helen witnessed and notarized everything, then put it all in a sealed envelope. Walking to my car, I felt lighter somehow. Not happy, but clear. Purposeful. I pulled out my phone and opened a group text to all 3 children. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard, and then I typed, I understand you're all very busy. I forgive you for missing the funeral. I know your father would forgive you too. I love you all. The responses came within minutes. Relief poured through their messages. Gratitude that I understood. Promises to visit soon. Declarations of love. I turned off my phone and drove home through streets Harold and I had driven together for 40 years. I didn't cry. I was done crying. 6 months passed like water through my fingers. The house felt different now, but not in the way I expected. I'd thought Harold's absence would hollow it out, make it unbearable. Instead, I'd filled it with a life I never knew I wanted. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I volunteered at the homeless shelter where Harold had spent so many Thanksgivings. I served meals, sorted donations, listened to stories from people who society had forgotten. A man named Gerald told me about losing his wife and then his job, and then his home, all within a year. A woman named Ruth showed me pictures of children she hadn't seen in 5 years. These people understood loss in ways my children never would. I started a grief support group at the church with Father Benedict's help. 8 people came to the first meeting. By month 3, we had 20. We sat in a circle every Wednesday evening and shared our pain honestly, without pretending we were fine, without rushing through our feelings to get back to normal. Normal was gone. I was building something new. My children called occasionally. Brief conversations squeezed between meetings and appointments and social obligations. Whitney mentioned visiting twice, but never committed to dates. Trevor sent expensive gifts for my birthday, a cashmere sweater I'd never wear, fancy chocolates I gave to the shelter. Natalie posted about family values on her blog, beautiful words about cherishing your roots, while living 3 miles away and never stopping by. I stopped waiting for them. It hurt less than I expected. Then Mrs. Webb had a stroke. I found out when her grandson knocked on my door one evening. His name was Tobias, and he was a nurse at County General. His grandmother had been asking for me. I spent every day at the hospital after that. Mrs. Webb couldn't speak much, but she squeezed my hand, and her eyes said, "Thank you." Tobias worked the same floor, and during his breaks, we'd sit in the cafeteria and talk. He asked about my family one day, why they never visited while I was there. I don't know what made me tell him the truth. Maybe because he was a stranger. Maybe because keeping it inside had become too heavy. I told him everything. The funeral with empty chairs, the text messages, the changed will. All of it spilled out in that fluorescent-lit cafeteria while other people's families came and went around us. Tobias listened without judgment. When I finished, he asked a simple question that cracked something open inside me. "What would Harold want you to do?" I went home that night and sat in Harold's study, surrounded by his shrine to our children. All those framed articles and photos and achievements, evidence of love that had only flowed one direction. What would Harold want? He'd want his family together. He'd want forgiveness and second chances. He'd want me to believe the best in our children, the way he always had. But Harold had also wanted them at his funeral. Harold had wanted phone calls returned and visits that actually happened. Harold had wanted to matter to the people he'd devoted his life to. I couldn't give him what he'd wanted then. But maybe I could give him one more chance to reach them now. I called Whitney first. "I need you to come home for a weekend. All of you. It's important." "Mum, I have a really full schedule right now." "I don't care." The firmness in my voice surprised us both. "Your father has been gone for 6 months, and you haven't come home once. This isn't a request." Silence. Then, quietly, "Okay." I called Trevor next, then Natalie. Same conversation, same pushback, same final agreement. Something in my tone told them this was different. 3 weeks later, they all came home. I watched them arrive separately, pulling up in their expensive cars, looking uncomfortable and guilty. They'd grown into strangers, these children I'd raised, polished and successful and distant. We gathered in the living room, awkward and tense. They expected me to need something. Help with the house, maybe. Or health concerns. Or yes, probably inheritance talk. Instead, I took them to Harold's study. I showed them the walls he'd covered with their achievements. Whitney's hands trembled as she looked at cases she'd forgotten she'd won. Trevor's eyes filled with tears, seeing articles about campaigns from years ago. Natalie broke when she saw the binders of her blog posts, every single one. Printed and saved. "Your father kept all of this," I said. "Every article, every mention, every success. He was so proud of you." Then I read from Harold's journal, entries I'd found hidden in his desk drawer. "Whitney called today. She sounded stressed. I wish I knew how to help her. Trevor's business failed. He seems ashamed. I told him I'm proud of him for trying. I don't think he believed me. Natalie's blog is beautiful. She has her mother's way with words." I commented, but she didn't respond. Maybe she's too busy. Entry after entry of a father loving children who were slowly forgetting him.